This is BBC News. I'm Nancy Kacungira with the headlines. The sky over the stadium exploded with colour as fireworks marked the start of the Olympic Games. In a pared-back, COVID-safe ceremony, small groups of athletes from more than 200 countries marched in the team's parade. In other news, the US denies a change in policy as it bombs Taliban positions in Afghanistan. We get the story behind the soaring price of the beans in your coffee, and here's a clue: it's not COVID. Also, we talk to the supermodel who's given up her career, saying it's incompatible with her Muslim faith. Hello and welcome to BBC News in the UK and around the world. After months of uncertainty and a build-up marred by controversy and resignations, the delayed 2020 Tokyo Olympics are finally underway. Even though the Japanese capital is under a state of emergency because of COVID, Olympic officials still managed to pull off a thoughtful opening ceremony watched by millions around the globe. Lucy Hawkins is in Tokyo.
There wasn't exactly a party-like atmosphere in Tokyo today. Still a lot of fear and anxiety around the rising COVID infection rates. And of course, this is still a city in a state of emergency with bars and restaurants shutting at 8 o'clock and people being told to stay home and stay safe because of the pandemic. And the cost of these Olympic Games and the pandemic mean there have been a lot of protests. Recent opinion polls still saying that over 55% of the Japanese public didn't want these Olympics to happen. And even as the Olympic ceremony got underway, we could hear a small crowd of very vocal protesters outside the stadium chanting, saying, "Stop the Olympics, how can you call this a festival of peace?" So you can see different emotions here in the Japanese capital today. But nonetheless, the ceremony happened. It started with fireworks. It was very stripped down and simple in terms of the ceremony. There were less than 1,000 foreign dignitaries there, not nearly the number of athletes that we would normally see in this stadium, but a message of hope that the Olympics can be the light at the end of the tunnel of the pandemic. Very somber moment when they paid tribute to those that have died from COVID-19 and those that have cared for people around the world during the pandemic. So very much a nod throughout the ceremony to what the world is facing right now, the fragile place that the world is in. And as the Games finally do kick off, the organisers will be hoping that our attention turns to what happens in the field of play, in the sport, and they are still, of course, facing that massive challenge of keeping everyone connected to these Games safe.
Lucy Hawkins in Tokyo for us there. Well, it is the moment of truth. The athletes will be getting ready for the Games to begin. We can now speak to Dr. David Fletcher, a sports psychologist at Loughborough University. Thank you, Dr. Fletcher, for joining us. Just talk to us a little bit about what it must be like for these athletes now. This is an Olympics like no other.
Yes, I mean, it'll be getting very real for them now. They'll be getting a mixture of anxiety and nerves, coupled with some excitement as well, I think, especially with the opening ceremony this afternoon. As I say, it'll be getting really real for them, and it'll be a whole mixture of positive and more negative types of emotions as they head into the competition.
And what kind of training will probably come in handy now? Because sports men and women are used to blocking out all types of distractions, aren't they? But will this be a lot different from what they're used to?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned training. I mean, gone are the days when athletes just focus on physical and technical training. A lot of these athletes will have prepared psychologically, working alongside a sports psychologist and their coaching staff to prepare for the Games itself. And we know that the Games is arguably the most pressurised competition in the world. And as you say, combine that with COVID and all the restrictions and the worries and concerns around health, the lack of audience, those types of factors. But they will have considered that, actually. The English Institute of Sport, who play a key role in preparing our athletes, they've had a programme of work for the past 18 months specifically focused on preparing our athletes mentally for these challenges.
And of course, the other difference this time round is that there won't be any spectators, no fans to cheer them on. What sort of impact does that have on the psychology of an athlete?
Yeah, it varies very much from athlete to athlete. I mean, some athletes actually get really quite nervous as they walk out into an Olympic arena. It is like no other cauldron of fierce competition, and the crowd itself can add a dynamic to that. But of course, for the Japanese athletes, they would have benefited from the home support. They'll no longer have that. So I think it's very much on a case-by-case basis. But I personally think for the majority of our athletes, it won't actually make that much difference, because if you think about it, they train on a day-to-day basis without big crowds watching them. And also they've been competing in the lead up to these games with low numbers of crowds or no crowds at all. So, for example, the Olympic trials for a lot of our different sports have had minimal crowds. So, as I say, I think they'll actually be ready for this, and that won't be a key factor. And the fact that there'll be an Olympic medal on the line in the finals will be enough motivation for them.
And of course, the run-up to this has been quite different as well. Many have had different training conditions. Is that going to have a significant effect on how they can perform on the day?
Yeah, again, it will very much depend on the athletes themselves. I mean, the athletes that are training in our national centres will probably have an advantage over those that are based more spread out across the country. But I think one of the big pluses for Great Britain is our infrastructure and not just our sporting system, but also our vaccine rollout, that I think we've probably had a bit of a head start over other countries in terms of preparing our athletes and getting them ready. So if I'm working with an athlete this evening, I'll be telling them to focus on what they've done well in their training, and also to remember that a lot of their opposition won't have had the quality preparation that they've had.
Well, Dr. David Fletcher, I'm sure we know what you'll be doing this weekend, watching the games. Thank you very much for your time. Well, these games have been a long time in the making. Our correspondent Rupert Wingfield-Hayes is in Tokyo, and he's been assessing the hurdles that these games have had to encounter.
For the Uno family, it has been a long, anxious wait to get to this moment. The Unos are serious Olympic fans. Dad has spent over £3,000 on Olympic tickets. So you can imagine the mixed emotions they're feeling tonight.
Yeah, we think about, the kids. It's very first time to have the held the Olympic in Japan. So we were excited.
I am very disappointed, Masato Uno says. If they were not going to have spectators, they should have postponed again until next year. Then we could have welcomed people from abroad properly. Those who think the whole show should have been scrapped long ago were out on the streets again this evening. But they were vastly outnumbered by the crowds that have turned out to try and get a glimpse of the action. This was Shinjuku Park at lunchtime, as Japan's Air Force display team painted the Olympic rings across the sky.
Olympics is it's one of the once-in-a-lifetime kind of event, right? So I just wanted to have my kid, to have experience to see those athletes at least. But, due to this COVID-19, I guess, things gotta be the way it is.
For months we've heard that Japan doesn't want the games, that people are afraid. It didn't look like it tonight.
The contrast between what's going on inside the Olympic Stadium tonight and what's going on outside in Tokyo could not be more stark. Because of COVID, because of the state of emergency, the stadium seats are empty, and yet here we are right outside, tens of thousands of people gathered in public squares and public parks to try and glimpse a bit of the action. And if you go in the streets around here, the restaurants are all full, life is going on as normal.
There's some pretty strange logic going on here.
I am sure the government is taking measures to prevent the spread of the virus by separating the athlete from the public. So I'm not worried.
For some, these scenes show the ban on Olympic spectators is unnecessary. But with COVID cases in Tokyo climbing rapidly, others will say this demonstrates exactly why the spectator ban is needed.
Rupert Wingfield-Hayes reporting. Let's step away from the Olympics now. The US has launched a number of airstrikes in Afghanistan against Taliban positions in recent days, despite having withdrawn 95% of its forces from the country. A Pentagon spokesman did not provide further details on the attacks, but the Taliban said some had been close to the southern city of Kandahar, where the militants have been advancing in recent weeks. Our Afghanistan correspondent Secunda Kermani is in Kabul.
US officials have confirmed that a number of airstrikes were launched in support of Afghan forces in recent days, and we understand that at least some of them have been around the southern city of Kandahar. That's a city that's both strategically and symbolically important, and there's increasing concern about the way the Taliban are pressing in on it. Now, these airstrikes are said to have targeted military equipment and vehicles seized by the Taliban from Afghan forces, and they were what's called over-the-horizon operations. In other words, involving aircraft not stationed in Afghanistan but flown in from elsewhere in the region for these strikes and then flown out once again. Now, these strikes will have been useful in holding back the Taliban advance around the city, but there's real concern about what will happen after the end of August. That's the deadline for the withdrawal of all remaining international forces. And US officials have been suggesting that after August, any of these over-the-horizon airstrikes will no longer target the Taliban. They'll just target groups like Al-Qaeda or IS. And Kandahar is just one of a number of cities in Afghanistan that's feeling the pressure from the Taliban. The group have seized around half of all territory in the country, though no major city as of yet.
Secunda Kermani reporting. President Xi Jinping has paid a surprise visit to the politically sensitive region of Tibet, the first by a Chinese president in more than 30 years. His visit is only being covered by state media because of the sensitivities of the trip. Many exiled Tibetans accuse Beijing of religious repression. There have been tensions too with India. The head of the BBC's Chinese service, Howard Zhang, gave us his view of the purpose of the visit.
There's speculations and analysis from different walks. One of the main thought is that Xi Jinping is trying to emphasize his push for a different type of nationalist agenda. And in recent years, people have noticed changes in some of the Chinese ethnic policies, such as trying to force different ethnic groups to have a national identity, a melting pot identity, and trying to make their religion and cultures more secularized, more fitting into the main kind of a communist-led state structure. I think that's many people's interpretation. He's trying to put more emphasis on that. But of course, the timing is also quite crucial, because it's also at that juncture of 70 years of the Chinese army entering Tibet and signing what they call the Peaceful Liberation Treaty. So I think there are multiple factors here.
Howard Zhang from the BBC's Chinese service. Stay with us on BBC News. Still to come, we'll hear from the supermodel who's given up her career because she says it's incompatible with her Muslim faith.
Coming down the ladder now. It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
A catastrophic engine fire is being blamed tonight for the first crash in the 30-year history of Concorde, the world's only supersonic airliner.
It was one of the most vivid symbols of the violence and hatred that tore apart the state of Yugoslavia. But now, a decade later, it's been painstakingly rebuilt and opens again today.
There's been a 50% decrease in sperm quantity and an increase in malfunctioning sperm unable to swim properly.
Thousands of households across the country are suspiciously quiet this lunchtime as children bury their noses in the final instalment of Harry Potter.
Hello, this is BBC News, the latest headlines. The opening ceremony of the Tokyo Olympics has taken place in a largely empty stadium, but the man in charge has described this as a day of hope. The US bombs Taliban positions in Afghanistan despite having withdrawn 95% of its forces from the country. As water is pumped from tunnels submerged in deadly flash flooding, more bodies are being found in China's Henan province, and the death toll is rising. It currently stands at 51, but is expected to rise further. Officials say that nearly 400,000 people have been moved to safer areas, and now the flooding has moved to different towns and cities in the province as more rivers burst their banks. China correspondent Stephen McDonnell reports from Beijing.
People in their hundreds of thousands have been moved to safety in central China's Henan province. Deadly flash flooding, following record-breaking heavy driving rain, has shut down cities and towns across the region. Some people have been trapped for days, cut off by the rising waters without fresh food or water. Officials say tens of thousands of rescuers have been mobilised, including the military, to reach stranded residents and evacuate the most dangerous areas. The rain has eased in Zhengzhou city, and water is being pumped from rail and car tunnels. As these tunnels are cleared, bodies are being found, pushing up the official death toll. While the emergency situation may have improved in Zhengzhou, elsewhere it's become more dire. Floodwaters have spread to new locations, with more rivers in Henan province breaching their banks. Makeshift bridges are being put in to allow emergency teams to operate. On social media, China's rapidly growing cities have been criticised for not better preparing for catastrophic weather events. At times, the drainage infrastructure here has not kept up with increased population density. Chinese scientists are warning, though, that the source of this devastating weather can be traced back to climate change, leading to calls for a much more rapid plan to ameliorate it. Over the coming days, the priority is going to be surviving the current flooding crisis. The rain hasn't stopped in Henan, and over the weekend, a typhoon is expected to hit China's east coast. Stephen McDonnell, BBC News, Beijing.
In Western India, more than 100 people have been killed after torrential monsoon rains triggered landslides and flooding in the state of Maharashtra. Officials say dozens of bodies have been recovered from a landslide in the district of Raigad, with more feared trapped. Hundreds of villages and towns are without electricity and drinking water. Our correspondent Sarah Campbell reports.
Whole areas of the state of Maharashtra are underwater, the result of torrential rain triggering devastating landslides. Battling fast-flowing currents and submerged dangers, the country's National Disaster Response Force.
32 houses have collapsed in the landslide due to excessive rain, and the rescue operation is there going on, and DRF is there. As per the latest report, we have recovered about 32 bodies, and some more are said to be trapped there.
Residents are now counting the cost of their losses, their homes and possessions lost or destroyed.
I had 3 vehicles. All of them got submerged in the floodwater. They are all damaged. The furniture inside my house and outside also got damaged.
This is monsoon season, but the rain has been too much for many areas to cope with. It's thought that more than half a metre of rain fell in parts of India's west coast in just 24 hours. The authorities were forced to evacuate people from low-lying areas as water was released from dams which were threatening to overflow.
If the water is released from the dam today and the rainfall continues, floodwater could enter our homes.
And the situation is set to worsen. India's meteorological department has issued red alerts indicating the torrential rainfall is expected to continue. Sarah Campbell, BBC News.
Now, we could soon be paying more for our cappuccinos and lattes, and that's because the price of coffee beans has gone through the roof. Arabica coffee futures have risen around 25% in a week to their highest in more than 6.5 years. So what's behind the record spike? Kona Hack is the head of research at an agricultural commodities merchant.
The reason for the big price jump is because Brazil, which is the world's largest producer of coffee and also the world's largest exporter of coffee, has just suffered some pretty bad news on its crop. Brazil earlier this year had a very bad drought, one of those historically bad ones. So this year was already going to be a very small crop. On top of that, overnight this week, we've had quite severe frosts. Temperatures have fell below 5 degrees. It's their winter. And this kind of frost hasn't happened since 1994. And this has the potential to really, really impact next year's crop. So you potentially could have 2 crops consecutively much lower than needed.
Kona hack. In South Africa, towns and cities are cleaning up after the recent riots that killed over 200 people. The unrest is expected to hit the economy hard and could lead to the loss of thousands of jobs. But it could have been much worse had it not been for communities working together. Vumani Mkhize reports on how one man managed to save over 2,000 jobs in Soweto.
Nhlanhla Lax is celebrating an end to an unusual mission in Soweto, South Africa's largest township.
We had the confidence to carry on this mission and see it through. Now the mall is opening. The mission was a success.
During the recent rioting and looting that rocked the country, Maponya Mall, the biggest shopping complex in Soweto, remained untouched, thanks to Nhlanhla.
So I said to myself, this is way bigger than me. I can't stop it alone. So I'm going to call all the men in Soweto to rise and take responsibility.
This is what could have happened. Soweto's other shopping center, Jabulani Mall, was ransacked and remains closed. The riots were sparked by the arrest of former President Jacob Zuma after he failed to appear before a corruption inquiry. It quickly degenerated into wide-scale looting in the KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng provinces. When the dust settled, over 200 people had lost their lives, around 160 malls were badly damaged, and some 3,000 shops had been looted.
This flame is a symbol of our young democracy. It burns day and night. Now, the events of last week, which President Cyril Ramaphosa calls an insurrection, jeopardized 28 years of nation building and highlighted that even our so-called stable democracy can come under threat.
Socio-economic factors were also to blame. Some have been warning for years that an implosion was looming.
There's no society on the planet that can sustain this level of impoverishment and social desperation without some kind of massive upheaval.
3 out of 4 youths are unemployed, leaving many disillusioned about their future.
People are living in poverty. There's nothing. There's nothing. We are work slave.
Living here is about the struggle every day, man. You gotta make sure that you get out of here.
The economic repercussions caused by the civil unrest are already being felt across the country. Ultimately, it could cost $3.4 billion in lost output and jeopardize 150,000 jobs.
What we really need to do is expedite the implementation of job creation, ensuring that we also, as we grow the economy sustainably and equitably.
If it were not for people like Nhlanhla, it could have been much worse. As a young community leader, he's proud to have saved over 2,000 jobs at Maponya Mall.
It makes me speechless and very emotional to see that we've got people that are working. We've got people that their jobs are saved and the mall is functioning, not a glass broken. So for me, it warms my heart.
Nelson Mandela once said, "It's easy to break down and destroy. The heroes are those who make peace and build." But what these riots have reminded us is that there are millions of poor and marginalized people in this country, and they have a voice, and they too want to be heard in this democracy.
Vumani Mkhize, BBC News, Johannesburg.
When the supermodel Halima Aden announced she was quitting modeling in November last year because it was incompatible with her Muslim faith, her exit sent shockwaves through the fashion industry. Now, Halima, who became a trailblazer for wearing her hijab on the catwalk and in photo shoots, has told the BBC in a new documentary that towards the end of her modeling career, she felt she had lost control of her identity. Here's what she had to say.
You know, it's not that I was made to do things that I didn't want, but I think like many models, you know, you start off very young. I was 19 when I started modeling, and I remember bringing sets, a suitcase to sets full of hijabs and fabrics and leggings and sweaters and turtlenecks and all these things that I would bring and work with the stylist on set to achieve the shoot. And then the last 2 years of my career, I kind of trusted the stylist on set to style me. And that's when I saw that my image was changing, my hijab style was changing. It kept getting smaller and smaller. And in a way, I had almost lost my true identity as a hijab wearing Muslim woman, because the styles that they were dressing me in didn't really make it a hijab. It was hats and accessories and jeans and Versace this and that in place of a traditional hijab is my point. So, you know, when along with a lot of people, you know, when COVID-19 happened, I had the chance to, you know, stay off and reflect. And like many people, I decided that, you know, I wanted to make career changes.
Halima Aden. A reminder of our top story: the Olympic Games have been formally opened by Emperor Naruhito of Japan at a pared-down ceremony in Tokyo. Beautiful pictures there. Stay with us on BBC News.